Hi, this is Derek Murphy from creativity.com. Last year, when I started Book Butchers, we put up a little ebook about self-editing because I don't think writers necessarily need to pay a lot of money for editors. And in some cases, if you're self-publishing, it makes more sense to self-edit or to trade reviews or blurbs or to get a writing group for critique because especially for fiction, the story structure, the characterization, a lot of that stuff matters more than the writing quality. And I think you can get away with a few typos or grammatical errors, not a ton, but if you missed a couple in your manuscript and they're still there when you publish, that happens even to traditionally published books. It's not the end of the world. What is the end of the world is if your story isn't good enough and nobody likes it and you don't sell any books. So what I want to do quickly, I'll just go through some of these tips that we put together in this free ebook that you can download and read if you want, but I'll just talk about some of the tips that we notice a lot because we edit a lot of fiction and mostly fiction books. A lot of them are from first-time authors who haven't really figured out the craft yet. And what happens when you're a first-time author learning how to write, you make the same kind of mistakes that everybody else always makes when they're learning how to write. And if you're an editor, you come to be very familiar with these mistakes because you're always almost teaching the same things to beginning authors all the time. So I'll go through one by one. There's 25 of these. I'll try to go pretty quick. Self-editing tip number 1. Does the world need this book and why? You need to think when you're publishing a book, who's going to read it? Does anybody want it? How is it different from anything else? Is there enough readership out there to support the amount of time that you're investing in this book? You have to kind of think about, unless you want to be a martyr and work for free or be a starving artist, which I don't recommend, I've done that, what you probably want to focus on is making enough money after you publish to pay for the time that you spent writing the book. And if you want to do that, you have to think about who's going to buy it, where are they, and who's going to read it. You have to know those things. And if you want to make a lot of money, it makes sense to research the most popular genres and to look at the books in those genres and to know something about them. If you want to write self-help nonfiction, you should have read the top 20 books in your category, and you should know how they're organized and what they talk about and what kind of writing style they use. Same thing if you are writing paranormal romance. You can't just write on a whim. You can't just start from a blank slate. There's already, for whatever genre you're trying to reach or write about or write for, there's already a million people who like reading that genre, but they expect certain things, and you have to do certain things to satisfy them. If you're trying to write a vampire romance, there's probably 20 million people who are eager to read another vampire romance novel, but they're going to expect certain things from you. You can't just say, I'm going to reinvent the whole genre and write some totally different, weird, twisted thing to surprise readers, because they're not going to enjoy that. What you have to do is find, for most fiction, there's a template. So for paranormal romance, you have to read, 25 of the best-selling paranormal vampire romances, break them down, what happens, what are the characters like, what are the character arcs, what's the plot flow and structure, break it down into steps that they all have in common, and then make sure that your book follows that basic outline. For almost all fiction books, you can download, there's spreadsheets you can download that show you, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and they break it down into how many words should be in each chapter. You need to start with a map before you start writing and make sure that map is going to hit the right buttons to satisfy the right readers of that genre. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble when you publish, because even if it's a big genre, you may not have written something that really appeals to those readers. Who's your hero? Another one. It's interesting with your hero, you have to make likable characters. What doesn't really work, and I see this a lot, is you start out with a lot of action. You say you don't want a clear black and white moral universe, so you just throw a whole bunch of bombs and chaos and shooting and blood, and you don't know, if you haven't given your reader time to get to know your characters, they're not going to care who lives and dies. If you throw them into a car chase scene with bad guys and cops and helicopters and shooting and death, if they don't know who they're supposed to root for, if they don't know who's the good guy, that scene is not going to be exciting for them. There's no stakes. They don't care if anybody dies because they don't know the characters. So you've got to have a hero who's a hero and a bad guy who's a bad guy. You can still make them nuanced. You can still make, characters with flaws and bad guys who are sympathetic, but you have to make it clear in the whole story what readers should root for, what's good, that what the good ending would be, what the bad ending would be, so that they know what to what to hope for, what to expect, and they know when to be disappointed if the hero doesn't get them to that right climax. Same thing for what does your hero want? Your hero has to want something. Something has to be stopping them from getting it. I read something really good about writing recently. I put in all of my fiction writing is just in every chapter, it starts open-ended, then there's a choice, and the hero has to want something, and somebody else either has to get the thing that he wants, or somebody else has to stop him from getting the thing he wants. And then he makes another choice, and he does something else. There's always opposition in every chapter, and the hero can't just get what he wants. You can't just have a wish fulfillment novel where, you go to Disneyland, you win the lottery, and you spend a lot of money. There has to be a lot of conflict, and there has to be a lot of negative stuff happening. Your character has to want something and not get it for a really long time. Everything he tries to do to get the thing that he wants leads him further away from what he wants, until usually he changes or learns something about himself and then becomes the character he needs to be to get what he wants at the end. I'm skipping a few of these actually. I'll go over this one, head hopping. You have to know whose head you're in. So if you're writing from one protagonist and you're only in their head, are you writing first person omniscient or second person limited? You have to know who's telling the story and how far they can see, and are they able to read everybody's thoughts, or do you switch back and forth between different people? In most cases, you want to pick something like, for me, I couldn't really start, when I tried to write fiction, I started out with third person omniscient because I wanted to tell everything. To get the whole story, I had to show everything and show inside the thoughts of everybody. And I couldn't do that any other way. But I had a lot of trouble with that perspective because I wasn't used to writing that way. I was used to writing journals where it's first person. And so I didn't make any progress with my fiction until finally I just decided to write everything in first person by choosing one character and writing in first person from that character's point of view, which is limiting because you can't see into other people's heads. But what you can do that works sometimes is to have two characters that flip back and forth, two main characters, usually in a romance, where the first one is talking and then the second one's talking. And that works if you have two characters who are kind of partners and they can be in different places and seeing different parts of the story. I'm skipping over a bunch of these actually. You can read them in the free book, but I don't think I can just explain them in the video. Adjectives and adverbs, this is an easy one. When you're self-editing your own novel, most of your adjectives, and especially your adverbs, are not strong words. Usually you use them to kind of move things along, especially adverbs. Instead of using an adverb, you really just need better word choice. You need to be more descriptive and choosing words that really show what the reader is doing. Adverbs are kind of lazy. Let me skip down here. I said this again at the end. Adverbs are lazy writing. If you say he said something excitedly, what does excited mean? It means they looked excited when they said it, but you're not showing them what they're doing. You're just describing what they look like when they said it. Instead of said excitingly, you could say said, a grin spreading at the corners of his mouth and his body quivering with expectation. Instead of left resolvedly, you can say stamped out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Usually you can just search for ly endings. So you can search your whole manuscript, use search and find, and you'll find all the adverbs you used, and just see if you can replace most of them with more descriptive showing of what the character is actually doing, not just using an adverb to show how they're doing it. The other one that bothers me when I'm editing fiction is too many exclamations, especially first-time writers. They'll use a lot of exclamation points or a lot of question mark exclamation points or a lot of triple exclamations or like 5 exclamation points and then some question marks at the end of a sentence. They're doing that because they want to show when someone yells or screams something, and you don't need to do that with exclamation. You can just say he screamed, or you can say he did something, show something with the body. You can't just add a lot of exclamation. But also, because the more you use it, the less power it has. And people don't usually shout and scream and yell at each other all the time. And they're not usually super surprised and super emotional all the time. So if you have characters who are screaming and yelling all the time with 10 exclamation points, it just seems melodramatic and kind of cheesy. One is enough almost all the time. But even then, like my fiction almost never has any exclamation points because my characters don't yell at each other very much. There might be a couple of them sometimes, or I might just say he shouted. But just be careful when you search for, I would go through your fiction and search for exclamation points and just see if you're using too many or if you're using them all the time, because they lose value. If you use them on every page, by the end of the book, they're invisible and nobody knows if somebody's yelling or they're just talking or what. The other thing that bothers me about indie authors, when you're first writing out, you may like what's called purple prose. And purple prose is just fancy writing. It's fun to play with English. English is a fun language. You can pick all these cool words and put them together in these weird ways. It's fancy. What happens when you're doing fancy writing is you're drawing attention to yourself, the narrator, and you're getting in the way of the characters and the plot. It's okay for the characters to talk fancy. If you have a educated character and you want them to talk fancy by using all these cool, witty words, that's fine. But when you're describing a scene and you use these fancy, clever words, it just draws attention away from the story. And it's like, hey, look at me, I'm an author and I know how to use these awesome words. There are some words that bother me, like purchase still bothers me when you use it. For example, instead of using it to buy, to use it purchase, like I climbed up the hill and my toes just barely caught purchase on the cliff's face. That's a weird way. For me, it's weird use of the word purchase. It's technically correct, but when you use purchase 4 times in a novel, it's drawing my attention too much, and I know this author really likes the word purchase and they're overusing it, and it distracts me from the story because the characters aren't using it, it's just the author. So it's putting the author into the story. The author shouldn't be in the story. The author should be completely out of the way, completely invisible. you can actually, there's a tool that I put, it's textanalyzer.net. You can analyze your entire manuscript and it will tell you the most common words to see if you have any patterns. If you notice very special fancy words showing up too often, then that's a habit. If you notice you have certain writing habits and you tend to prefer, usually it's just a handful. You might have like 5 words that you really like that you overuse. And once you find those, they're hard to notice on your own, but you've got to kind of break the habit of using those words that call attention to yourself and take the reader out of the story. The last thing I'll mention, well, a couple more things. Believable characters don't flip-flop or show ridiculous emotions. A lot of problems with characterization that early first-time writers have is that the characters get too excited and too sad, and something happens and they're miserable and shaking and crying and sobbing for hours, and then they're happy and laughing hysterically and rolling on the floor, and it just goes back and forth. Most people don't show those kind of physical emotions that much, especially when something bad happens. Most people don't freak out and cry or become hysterical. A lot of people hold it in or they're silent. You have to find other ways to show pain and trauma and suffering or joy without reducing your characters to comic strips where it's kind of just silly and melodramatic. Also, your characters have to have a reason to do things. You can't have stupid characters. If you have stupid characters, they won't be sympathetic, and your readers will be like, why am I reading a book about this really stupid guy who does things for no reason? There has to be a strong and believable motivation for everything the character does that's not total random accident. Even though, sometimes accident works, like I can go to a store and this girl that I hate also happens to be at the store and we run into each other and we have an episode that leads to something else. That's drama, that's fine. Coincidences are okay. But too many coincidences, especially any kind of coincidence that ends the book, where it's like everything's going to shit and then luckily something happens at the very end and everybody's saved, that's not going to work. You have to have a reason that things turn out okay. But for your characters, you have to have them think about what they want and what they're going to do, and you have to make them make smart, believable choices based on something. They have to be rational. They have to think it's a good idea to do this. Or if they're going to be irrational and stupid, you have to explain why. Maybe they say, I know this is a bad idea, but I'm just so angry, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway. That's an okay choice, but you can't just have them say, I'm just going to do this for no reason without explaining it, because your readers deserve to know if they're going to read this story about a character, they need characters that are smart and sympathetic and aren't just puppets to make sure that the story happens. I'm going to stop there. I feel like I'm kind of rambling on, but I'm also just learning how to write fiction. I've been a book editor for several years. I'm doing my PhD in literature, but I'm in the middle of writing several novels. I've been writing for like 10 years, so I figured a lot of this stuff out a long time ago, but it's still difficult to put the story together and make it all work. So I'm enjoying that challenge. I don't do book editing anymore, but I set up Book Butchers a while ago, and like I said, there's this free book about self-editing on the website that you can get for free, and I'll put the link down below. Thanks, bye-bye.